Hello, welcome to another entity Standup. Back there. Yeah, so high quality production values as always.
I like that song too.
Essentially framework community. We talk about more than EF and EF Core on this show. We do a lot of .NET stuff, and this week we're really excited to have Nick Craver and Marc Gravell from Stack Overflow, and they're going to talk about Dapper. So that's be really exciting. We've been looking forward to this one for a while. Before we do that, let's do a quick update of what's happening in EF Core with State of Unicorn. Basically, right now we are closing down on EF 6.0. So it's not going to be out for a couple of months now, but we're really kind of pushing the latest bugs and final features in. We've had more than 80 PRs in the last 2 weeks, which is pretty impressive from the team. So many thanks to them and the community. RC1 is coming soon, and it's feature complete, except the column attribute, using column attribute to order columns, didn't make it into RC1, and we're still trying to get that into RC2. But other than that, we're locked down for features. So once RC1 comes out, get it and give it a try and give us your feedback so we can fix things before we finally released. In those 80 PRs and ready for RC1, we have more group by support. Smith has done more query enhancements to support lots more cases of group by. You can now scaffold many-to-many tables from an existing database, so you won't get the join table scaffold. It will just be in shadow state. And Shay is implemented from SQL on the Cosmos provider, so that allows you to drop down and write raw SQL on Cosmos just like you can on a relational database. And talking about Cosmos, let me just go. This is in the show links that will be on the YouTube link, and you can find that easily. This is a post from, or a GitHub repo from Jeremy, who's on the call here, and this is basically taking the Cosmos Quick Start and porting it to EF Core, and this was the configuration that you needed for the model in EF Core 5. In EF Core 6, It's much simplified because basically one of the features we've done is to make aggregates by default or by convention when you're using the Cosmos provider. So essentially you get all those embedded documents by default without having to manually configure your owns many, owns one, all that kind of stuff. So that's one of many features that we've added to Cosmos support in 6.0. So have a look for that in RC1. And then remember also in RC1 we have all these other features that we've talked about over the last few months, including SQL Server temporal table support, compiled models, migration bundles, the Tech Empower perf stuff where we got to, I think, within 4% of Dapper. So yeah, go check all that stuff out in RC1 too. And there's more. We always talk about EF Core, but Bryce also works very hard on our Microsoft Data SQLite provider, and we now have connection pooling turned on by default in that. Normally on SQLite, the opening a connection is really fast anyway, so connection pooling doesn't help you much because it's basically just a file handle. But if you're using an encrypted SQLite database, then opening a native connection is actually very slow. So when you're using an encrypted database, this is a massive benefit. You can really now just open and close connections. Don't have to do anything special in the .NET level, and at the native level, we manage those connections for you. So lots of stuff coming in RC1, which will be out in a couple of weeks. And with that, let's kick over to Mark and Nick to talk about Dapper. Remove that.
Cool.
So what do you guys want to talk about?
I mean, do you want us to cover kind of what it is, or is that kind of assumed?
Yeah. Let's go into why what is Dapper?
Intro.
What do you use it for? Yeah.
Right, so historically, Dapper goes back to quite a long time. Back in the early days at Stack Overflow, we were using Link to SQL to do our database access, and it worked. It got the job done, except when it didn't. And basically, we developed a couple of tools. It's actually where Mini Profiler came in, and using Mini Profiler, we kind of showed two things. One is that, three things. The first thing is occasionally Link to SQL would just generate horrible SQL. I mean, that's just a feature of if you do complex queries in query interpretation, sometimes it just does weird things. That's just the reality. And obviously you can't kind of optimize it or anything if it's being generated. But the other thing we found using Mini Profiler was occasionally Link to SQL would just do a hard hang up, and it would basically take us offline. Something would blip during that parsing of the expression tree, and it would just kind of everything would kind of hang up, and it would take suddenly. Usually it'd be fine, and then all of a sudden, just generating the query plan, the SQL would take whether it was some kind of caching problem, I don't know, but it would take an obscene amount of time, and hurt us. And it's like for most of the things that we wanted to do, we didn't actually have an awful lot of complexity. We do actually keep things pretty simple. It's usually a where clause and a select. That's pretty. We do a few more interesting things. Maybe an order by and a top. So we kind of reached the state where for most of our queries, actually we could write this by hand. We have engineers, developers who kind of know SQL, like SQL. They're perfectly happy working close to the database, and then we can actually do things like encourage people to test their queries when they're developing them in SSMS, looking at the query plan and stats and all those wonderful things. And we can put in hints if we need, and we can generate the query plans that we wanted to. So we decided that we wanted to do SQL a bit more manually. And I don't know if Link to SQL had APIs to do that, but it's like, well, at that point, we're not really using any of the Link to SQL features. So let's just put that to one side. We'll still use Link to SQL when we want to do something like a coordinated set of updates on relational data, where 6 related entities that all need to be saved as part of a transaction. Link to SQL, or these days EF, great for that. Perfect, no problem. We use the happy to use the right tool for the right job. But what we just basically did is moved all the hot path queries first of all so that we, instead of using link to SQL, we were just using this new tool that we wrote that basically just executed queries against the database, and then used, because I'm a bit of a ref emit nut, and then so we just kind of spat out the code to the IL at runtime to kind of bind those the results back to some arbitrary type, and that's basically kind of where Dapper came from. And it turned out it was a good tool. It turned out to be quite fast and very convenient for the way. I mean, the ADO.NET API directly for doing things like adding parameters and things like that. It works, but it's hard, and it's very easy to get it wrong.
Yes.
So unless you have somebody who's very, very, very experienced, I would wager that even if I looked at somebody who's been 5 years, 8 years, whatever in development, I'm pretty sure I could find wrong ADO.NET code. So so using a library is great there, because you can get all those skills and build them over time, and everybody benefits kind of all at once. So that's kind of what Dapper does. It just allows us to do parameterized SQL and project it back to a type. It's not clever. It doesn't do kind of change tracking and relational things and transactions and all those things for you. It doesn't need to. You can use other tools for that.
This is definitely one of the things that we see people doing very effectively, and that's using multiple tools, multiple libraries in the same application. So, EF Core and Dapper, like you guys
use
do,
them both.
Stack Overflow, that works very well. And to go back to what you said about ADO.NET, we never recommend that people write stuff in raw ADO.NET. It's like,
you hate them, I guess.
Sorry?
If you hate them, I guess.
Exactly.
It's so verbose, right?
We love
Even
all
doing
our
it right.
customers, so
That's actually a question I'd like to discuss a little bit, but more near the end, whether this is a direction we want to go to, like to improve that stuff as well. But I'm gonna shut up now.
Shay and I have slightly different opinions on that. But for me, it's like if you want fast, raw, low-level stuff, then use Dapper, because it basically doesn't get in your way, and and if you want something that, I mean, we see link queries that are like 3 pages long. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing to do. I mean, I would say generally don't have those 3-page link queries. But if you're going to do that, writing those correctly in SQL can be challenging, especially if you don't know SQL. So there's places for everything.
Yeah, especially if you're composing together multiple queries and
absolutely.
Yeah.
Link one of the nice things with Link is composability, obviously, where you can really patch up together like an expression tree and have these multiple pieces. Whereas when you're doing this with strings, composing your own SQL, then that's a different story, much harder.
Yeah. There were a bunch of things there that you said that I think would be interesting to hear more about. Let's see, where should we start? Well, okay, so you started with link to SQL, and I think a lot of us on the EF team now were, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but I think I've said it on one of these shows before, but we were more fan of link to SQL than EF, and in many respects, I remember Diego Vega and I talking about how EF Core was really kind of a philosophical successor to Link to SQL rather than Entity Framework. It shares a lot more in
the early versions of EF were hard to love.
Well, I mean, we've talked about those before, but they were based on this whole concept for entity data model, which was this big, massive infrastructure underneath anything that, exactly, that nobody needed really. I mean, OData is still partly that, but other than that, it's kind of died. And so, how was your transition when you transitioned from using Link to SQL to EF Core? Did that go smoothly?
Except for a couple of notable outages. Yeah, it went okay. And we talked about the thing we hit mostly there, right?
Client evaluation.
All of this was spite-driven development at the time, right? What happened was Atwood said, this page is slow sometimes. And we said, no, it's not. It's not slow. And so then MiniProfiler was developed to prove him wrong. And then, we loaded it and we're like, son of a, he's right. And then we figured out it's linked to SQL and logged the queries and figured out that it's locking in the expression tree somewhere that we never got to the bottom of there. So when we eventually, when we were running Stack Overflow to .NET Core 2.1 at the time, we had to, Entity Framework was one of the, you update our libraries, update our dependencies, right? That was a massive change. And one of the things we deploy, we have a couple of services at stackoverflow.com, is like the app pool, the Q&A, right? The bicycles.stack exchange, that's one app pool. The other things like stackexchange.com, the top level is a different app pool. It's just a API wrapper that kind of shows some global stuff. That's one of those things we're like, we'll just deploy it last. Just make sure you clean up on the way out, right? It turns out that was what bit us, because it has this, if you go to your Stack Exchange page, which is like a global profile, we used like a GUID to identify you at that point in time. And it ran a query, and then it didn't know how to translate that particular, in that version, that's been fixed long since, but that version didn't know how to translate that to SQL. Yes. So what it was doing was pulling 160 million posts per page load back from SQL Server. And we're like, CPU's low. SQL doesn't care. Network bandwidth was just pegged to SQL. Like it was just eating 20, 40 gig of bandwidth. Solid.
That was one of the things that, because the whole idea that we would silently switch to client evaluation and pull back your data, was very controversial on the team, when we started EF Core. And, there's a number of reasons why it's not good in terms of both the robustness of the code base and avoiding breaking changes. And then the obvious one, which obviously we knew at the beginning, is what you're talking about. If somebody doesn't realize this, then this client evaluation can suddenly bring back millions of records and completely, kill your application.
So of course, it works fine on your local development machine when you've got a cleansed database.
So the transition between testing and production here is the crux of it. Yeah.
At the time that you guys hit this, there was already, I think, a fairly strong move on the team to say, okay, we tried that, wasn't a good idea. We put the logging in, but we don't think people are seeing the logging. It's really hard to know when this is happening. People don't even know about the logging. And then you guys hit this, and it was kind of like, okay, if Nick Craver didn't see the logging, because you switch off logging and you didn't realize this was happening, you went into production, how are we going to say anybody else is going to be safe doing this? And so that was actually kind of a pivotal point where we're like, okay, we've done this in up to 2.1, 2.2, I guess, and then for 3.1 we stopped doing that, and we said, right, we've got a query pipeline that translates enough now, and we're going to stop doing that automatic client evaluation, which I think was exactly the right thing to do. But you have to try some things, and sometimes you think, well, this is crazy, and sometimes it turns out you're wrong and it works out really well. And sometimes, like this time, it turns out actually, no, this was a crazy idea. So that was great feedback from you guys that I think we ended up in a better place because of it. I think we would have got there anyway, but it was certainly a kind of a pivotal point.
I remember this was like a major argument in discussions. At some point, we would just point to, but Stack Overflow, right? And that was like a winning argument, basically, for making that switch.
But that was one of the most fun bugs to find. Normally, there's like some other symptom, then we peg the network and it's running at full efficiency. It's just doing a weird thing. We hadn't actually hit that before. Like, of all the outages we've had. We're just like, that's weird. And one of our SREs was like, is it supposed to be pegging a 40 gig network? We're like, no, it's normally at 1%. No.
Yeah. So there's I mean, we've touched on this already, but there's like two people already asking, so when should I use Dapper and when should I use EF Core, right? That's that question. So we already mentioned, like, for example, one case is when you have these complex queries and you're composing them as well, then maybe that's one reason to use something that's more expression tree based, like EF or anything else that's expression tree based. I guess there's other, I mean, what do you guys, again, so like going deeper into this kind of thing, where do you guys use EF rather than Dapper in your own code base, and why?
So we tend to use EF if we're doing some kind of unit of work of some kind of bundle of changes that we're trying to commit as part of a transaction. Now, you can do that using Dapper and transactions and things like that, but you need to be a lot more careful about your change tracking. And sometimes we have kind of like side effect code, and it isn't that's kind of handled. We have some like methods that are dealt with via some magic attribute hookup things, and it's very hard to do that properly unless you have very linear, obvious code. So if you have something that's just going to say, I've got a unit of work, some kind of data context, DB context, whatever it is, and there are going to be some changes on here that I want to commit as a transaction. ORMs are great at that. That's kind of where they excel.
An example, I think, of one of the things that EF does that if you try and roll it your own can be difficult is the ordering of the statements that you send.
Yes.
Because in the update pipeline, EF will check, okay, well, we need to delete this one before we change that one, and we need to insert that before we set that foreign key, and so there's an ordering that happens, and it's very easy to have a situation where if you're trying to do that manually, you end up with a case where you do something in the wrong order without realizing it, and then depending on your data, then that can, crash everything. That's one place where I think it's useful.
And we get that ask. That happens all the time, right? Like, why don't you build this? Because we're building EF Core. Go use that.
I saw
there's no reason to build this again.
So I know you do have that layer. I think it's called Rainbow, right, on top of Dapper, which does some sort of like CRUD. Is that still a thing?
Little bit, super old. Hasn't gotten love in probably.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, when we moved the things to in GitHub, we moved it to a different org recently, and we're trying to separate out now what's the core bit and what's the kind of like the contrib and rainbow and things like that, because I mean the other reality is tools need to be maintained by people who are invested in them, and there are the clues in the name. Contrib wasn't written by mostly wasn't written by the kind of the core team, and we don't use it an awful lot, barely at all. And in some ways, what I'd really love to do is kind of pare what we think of as Dapper down to just kind of the core bits and possibly kind of the future bits, and split those bits off to the side and either park them or say, hey, does somebody want to kind of run with this, because who's actually interested in this and wants to improve it and is going to be able to test it, because
you can't make informed decisions about something that you are not actively using. I mean, we tell people this. We on the other libraries, StackChange, Redis, and all we use. We were like, "What about X?" We don't know about X. We are simply you're a bigger expert because you know the name than I am at X already opening this issue. I just can't give you a thing here. So with things like contrib and that sort of stuff's different. Dapper, for the next version, which we can go into if you want, like we have decent plans to change it quite a bit and how the fundamentals work, right? It's grown organically a little bit over time. There's sync and there's async. There's some things that have cancellation tokens and not. There's a little bit of cleanup there, but all those are breaking changes. So for the next version, what we probably want to do is move the async stuff off of IDP connection, which is not correct, to DB connection, like harden that, and then do a mapping of like a iDapper instead to make it a lot more testable on top of, and like a Dapper config, because some people want to
a mockable Dapper, basically, kind of
mockable thing. And also you could have a contextual, like an async local of T. So if anyone not familiar with async local of T, it's like a contextual aware async branching version of a variable. So if you like have it up here and you have an async method that calls an async method, if you change it here, it's below, and your child calls, you have that value, but when you come back up, you've got the former value. This is how MultiProvider does trees, for example. So if you have that, you could like say, okay, in this scope, use this Dapper config, because this is my Postgres settings for this stuff, and this is my SQL settings for some people have that case, and some people just have this hits an Azure database with these constraints, and this hits over here.
That's extremely interesting to me as well. That touches on the point of how the whole thing with MultiProvider is implemented as well. So what I'm hearing is you're going with an ambient, with an async local kind of solution to maybe, if I understood you correctly, right, to configure your, let's say, your specific database. That's been a subject we've discussed a lot in EF Core, comparing also with Dapper, where EF Core is. So I'm going to step back a little bit. So Dapper is basically, as it is today, like a set of extensions, right, over IDB connection and so on. So you basically have an IDB connection, which is the absolute low-level ADO.NET thing. And then over that, you can either use just ADO.NET, or you have the Dapper extensions to do it in a much more nicer way, right? Whereas EF Core went in a very, very different direction. I mean, one of the things I love about Dapper is how light it is. It's just a set of extensions. You're using the same IDB connection. There's no other concept you need to know about. It's all very, very simple and light, right? EF Core core went in a direction where you have, so it's a lot heavier conceptually, right? You have something called a DB context, and there's a configuration for that thing, and there's a provider model. And this brings me to the thing that I actually wanted to discuss, which is, so how do you distinguish between SQL Server, Postgres, or SQLite or whatever? There's a whole thing where you have to write a provider for a specific, database that's going to target that database, and that's going to integrate into the whole EF core thing. There's like a whole plugin infrastructure there, whereas in Dapper, things as today are completely different, right? So I'm hearing like a different direction.
We try and infer some things because it's like, I think you need to turn on bind by name, for example, on Oracle. If you don't get that right, then things don't work. But it's very hard to do correctly at the moment based on the connection, especially because we don't want to take those refs. So you've got to do everything ref emit. It's
how do you know what your connection actually represents, right?
And the other problem is, so we mentioned Mini Profiler earlier. So we actually Mini Profiler actually works as a decorator around the DB connection. And it just spoofs everything. It gives you here's your DB connection, and somewhere hidden underneath that is the real one. Of course, then you can't even tell, from the
provider is what we used to call those things.
Yeah. So that's the model. But if in Dapper, if each method, so this is also a maintenance problem too, right? People want to add a new feature or new thing. If we allow into each of the methods to take ambiently or specify a Dapper config, so you could override it per call, or you just get the ambient, that's your choice, then we can add things to that without breaking the world. Right now, you would have to change the signatures. While keeping it simple and it's just on the method signature, it works to a point. But in terms of maintenance and upgrades, that actually becomes problematic over time, right?
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Sometimes people want to enable or disable array support in Postgres. Or, oh my God, how many people want to quote or not quote? And every single person putting a PR thinks they're fixing it, but they break the other half. Like it's funny, and I get their perspective, but it's fun. Right?
Yes. So I'm inferring a little bit here, but I'm imagining when you use it in your own stuff, you're basically hitting SQL Server. And so to your point about you need people who are using these things, when it comes to people using Dapper against Postgres or MySQL or even, I guess, SQLite or anything like that, that's harder for you to maintain and to manage because you don't really do that yourselves, right?
I had one the other day. I can't even remember the name of it. I can look it up if you'd like. And it was some cloud provider database thing where they've got their own ADO.NET provider. And because it's a paid service, I tried to contact them to say, look, one of your customers is having a problem. Can you set me up with some kind of test account that no response from them? It's like, well,
help me help you.
Help me help. I'm not going to pay to be somebody's support.
I had the same thing. I don't want to badmouth anybody, but so I do NPG SQL, which is this Postgres thing, and Amazon AWS has something called Redshift, which is their data warehousing that's based on an old version of Postgres, and there's various incompatibilities, and every now and then I get those issues, and I want to have an instance I can test against, and I don't have one, and I went through the exact same thing. I try to get through to AWS support. Guys, I'm your driver for .NET. Give me an instance so I can fix the bugs or whatever. Never got it.
Lots of time taken to do things like that, right? As a maintainer, I can solve these 10 issues or this. It's a high cost.
But in the end, that user did get back to it. Gave me, contact me on privately and gave me an endpoint I could use, and we got it all sorted. It turns out their provider uses the question mark approach for parameters.
That's very close to my heart.
As a unique one, the parameter names must be named 1 or 2 or 3. Otherwise, it doesn't work.
Yet another weird parameter placeholder thing.
Wow. So Dapper's not as bad in this area because not a whole lot of features are. So sometimes like the whole thing is Postgres specific. Like if it were generating the SQL like EF Core, you have to do a lot more work, right?
Of course.
Dapper, not supporting any of those features, is a lot simpler in we just need to support what different query like arrays and things. So in that respect, the percentage surface area that is specific to the provider is much lower. And with the advent of containers coming out, it is significantly easier, right? When we run a test suite, I can just fire up the service containers for Postgres, MySQL, Mongo. Someone tried to do Dapper on Mongo. I'm not even sure that will work.
They have an ADO.NET provider.
I was like, what does that query look like? But all of those I could just spin the service scanners and run. What we do is we have a test suite that is, this may be similar to EF's current, I'm not sure the setup, but we just have a base test suite. And on top of that, you just have like an instance that is a parent class that just runs all the same tests again, but against MySQL or that kind of thing.
Yeah, we have a very similar, we call it a specification test suite to make sure all providers, like to give providers the service of, knowing exactly what works and what doesn't, like out of the box.
And then you can add a few specific into that area.
Right? Of course. And ignore certain ones which don't make sense on that specific provider or whatever, which work differently in some way. I just have one very small note because you mentioned the ambient and just anecdotally, because I did a lot of optimization on EF4 for 6. And one of the places where I found like a problematic slowdown was around async local. So we have something to detect accidental concurrent usage. So EF Core, like most things, is not thread safe. You can't use a DB context for multiple threads at the same time. And we have a mechanism that attempts to detect that, not 100%, but like, let's say a significant percentage. And for various reasons, it used async local as well. Because anyway, there was a whole thing there. I'm not going to go into it. And that turned out to be, so every query used async local to, coordinate this kind of synchronization check. And that turned out to be like a bit of a perf hotspot. So we have an option for disabling that check. And that's one of the things that improved Tech and Power Forge. So I'm just saying, if you're building upon async local, just sharing my experience there.
If you're locking around it or something, I could certainly see, because you got to switch execution context to check the underlying bits, right?
The idea of the concurrency detector is that it doesn't make it thread safe, right? Because if you make it thread safe just to detect, then you've kind of defeated the point, because then you're just as slow as you would be. So the idea is that it's not thread safe, and you could have race conditions which mean you run concurrently and do bad things. But on the average, if you run an application and it's doing this, then some of the time, hopefully a lot of the time, you'll get this and you'll throw an exception and you'll at least be told you're doing it wrong. So it's kind of that balance between, okay, we're not going to just lock everything in order to tell you that you can't do that, but we're trying to give you some feedback to tell you, don't do it. And there was some confusion in a question this week on GitHub that disabling the concurrency detector would allow you to actually run concurrently. It's like,
I want to run concurrently, so I'm just going to disable the checks.
Net.
Yeah, it's like the thing in WinForms where you can disable the check that it's on the UI thread. It's like, don't do that.
Don't do it. Yeah.
So we had a bug in Stack Overflow around this. We had a thing that deployed, and normally we don't want to spin up because we have not high scale. People are a lot bigger than us, but we have decent scale at low machine count, right? We run 9 web servers, so a high amount of efficiency and throughput. And so we don't like to open another connection if we've already got the current one. So actually the whole way our stack works is an ambient context. We have async local for everything. There's current.db is how, and we actually have an EF core data context. And Dapper, we proxy the extensions off that. So everything's actually across EF core.
Interesting.
This is so cheap. So what we do in some cases is if we have a current foreground connection, we will use that to do a thing and not spin up another one ambiently in the background to do some background or concurrent task, right? So in one place, it was a little tricky, and the handoff was wrong. And Mark and I and Kevin Montrose, we spent like 2-3 days tracking this down, losing our minds, because what was happening is like, hey, you've got site ID 8 million back. We only had like 500 sites. So we're like, what in the devil's going on? And it turns out that what we had was a connection that was handed off to this async method, also running some SQL. And so both of them were just mangling TDS streams, and just random bytes were being processed.
Yeah. Usually it'll error. Sometimes it doesn't error.
And it didn't want an error. It would just throw you back like unreasonable data that it thought was valid. It's scary, right? That
so I thought SQL client was actually completely like bulletproof against like detecting those kinds of things. So it is.
I can tell you it
turns out it's not. So yeah, don't turn off your concurrency detectors. That's a good feature.
Yes,
absolutely.
So I think I would like to get back and talk about ref emit in a minute, but let's look at some of the questions that have, because there's been a few questions here. Some of them, let's start with this one since it was earlier on. So when using multiple record sets, is there a solution to yield return each separate record on one trip? Now, I don't even know what that really means because I'm not an experienced Dapper user, but hopefully you guys know what that means.
There is an API for getting hold of something that's basically a wrapper around the data reader. Is it query multiple? I think it is.
Grid. The grid reader, we call it.
Yeah, it gives you back a grid reader, and that basically allows you to treat each consecutive result set in a very similar way as you would have done with previously. So it's got methods that are, I think it's called .read instead of .query because you've already done the query and now you're just doing a read. So once you've got that, you can iterate through, you can get hold of that data unbuffered. So if you want to do something yield returning, then sure, you can read through each one and get through what you want. I also don't quite understand the byte zero bit there, whether that's to do with I don't quite understand that, I'm afraid.
Well, they may follow up with another question, but that sounds good. So there's been a few questions. Eric EJ has been responding to some of this stuff, but basically about stored procedures. Let me see.
What are those?
Yes.
We don't. You can
So do you use stored procedures? I mean, do you find a use for them?
Almost never. Not in Stack Overflow. People use them. Dapper supports them, and all that's good. But we don't. The problem with stored procedures is a lot of things are easy when you don't have a 24/7 uptime service. When you have a 24/7 uptime service and you need to do rolling builds, certain things get 10 times harder. Stored procedures makes things a lot harder, in my opinion. There's several opinions on this course, mainly for and against. But if you change a stored proc, your code on web server, when do you deploy it? Do you deploy it midway through the build, old build, new, like before, at the end? You need to have code compatibility across two versions, and that makes deployments much harder. If we have just the database itself compatible with two versions, like, okay, we're going to drop a column, so let's drop the code usage of it, and then we'll drop the column. That's a build, and then you deploy, or the other way around. I add a column, and then I start using it, whatever order you have. If that's in the code, all we need to reason about is which goes first, database or code, and we roll it out. And if you change that query, we're changing it along the way. And if you're messing it up, you can stop midway between deploying 9 servers. After 4 go, and you're like, hey, those aren't coming back online, then you stop the build, right? And do we have automated tools that stop your build? And that's a really good way to, mitigate it.
That's a really interesting point about stored procedures that makes perfect sense, but I've never really thought about that before. But that's a really good point.
No, I can understand the use of stored procedures in some environments, especially where the API isn't going to change and it's allowing, like the
security.
There are some good reasons. There's the permissions things, the execute permissions, and there's having a separation of concerns, and it makes the DBA feel loved. Yeah, it's having somebody else who owns that. Personally, I prefer to have a bit of an end-to-end accountability on those, but not all environments are the same. What worries me more is when people say that they want to use stored procedures to prevent SQL injection. It's like, no, that's not what stored procedures do. If you want to prevent SQL injection, use parameters. There's 3 different things that people often conflate. There's command preparation, which doesn't hugely apply in SQL Server, applies much more in Postgres. There's parameterization, and there's stored procedures. The only thing stored procedures do is move your actual query to just a named element in the database, so that you're not sending that command backwards and forwards. Everything else that people claim about stored procedures, it used to be the case, like back in SQL Server 6 or something, that stored procedures were much, much faster. The SQL Server things have changed hugely. Yeah, it's all hugely cached and things like that. So, yeah, as long as people aren't saying to avoid SQL injection, then that's the moment when I just start walking away, because I can't argue with that, because there just isn't enough time.
My 2 cents about this as well is I want to have all my code in a single Git thing, right? So if I have my C# code, then that's it. That's enough, right? My application is that. And when I start to my code spills over to the database, then things are not so good. That's like that's one thing. And what was my other thing? I think I already managed to forget it. That was pretty quick. Anyway,
there's security too. You can have a store procedure that wraps tables you don't want to give 5 people access to. You want to narrowly scope, and that's either a view or a store procedure or something. So there's security ways. And now what's really like conflated this argument, because people Google for it and they're like, I see this on SQL 2018. We're like, oh god. So what happens is that stored procedures being compiled thing was an old thing that SQL Server used to do. Now there's native compilation, which is a new thing in SQL Server, which you can do with some stored procedure predicates and some things where some things don't, especially around custom functions, right, and scalars things. So now there's new information. Maybe Google it. No, it's still true, and you're like, oh, how long do I have for this conversation? But it is. It's one of those things that's come and gone. So it's very hard for someone that just is not familiar with SQL Server a lot to say, well, there's a whole story here, and what you're doing does not fit X. It's a Y, and takes
my
experience
of working since I've been working on EF stuff for 14 years or so now. When I started, store procedures was came up all the time. Got to be able to use store procedures. Now we rarely hear it. Like, yeah, it's still voted as an issue on EF Core, better support for store procedures, and there's people who want it, but relatively speaking, it's gone way down. It's I think a lot of people have moved away from writing everything with store procedures, which is probably a good thing. Although, to Shai's point, if you used EF Core migrations, you could write your SQL in the GitHub repo and then deploy it to your database.
That's true.
I'm not being serious, but yeah.
That is true, yeah.
We do still occasionally have people.
Can we talk about Dapper V3 already? I love talking about store procedures, but there's more interesting stuff here.
Let's just follow up on that byte 0. I saw there was a follow-up comment on that, but I can't find it now. Maybe
I see it. Used to separate records at the records at the destination. I'm not sure if they're storing multiple records per row.
Serialization or something.
Possibly. Yeah, if it's custom serialization, then you would have to. ADO provides no facility for this. You need to deserialize whatever you put into that field. I would say if that's the storage mechanism, depending on your RDBMS, right? Some things have arrays and things in there, and you can use those native types. MySQL, Postgres, SQL Server doesn't really have this except for custom types, which you probably don't wade into too much. But for just normal, hey, this is a text field. The only thing Dapper can expose it is as a text field. You can, as you iterate over, you can do query unbuffered, which will not create a whole list of the object. But still, that string is going to be allocated by the ADO.NET layer, which is something that the people in this call have been working a little bit on. What are the inefficiencies of that may or may not be able to be removed. But if you're in an RDBMS that you cannot use array types like that, like SQL Server, then you may want to relook at like how those are stored. Maybe it is a join or a different table. What's your cardinality? If you're not storing an entity per row and you don't have array types, you probably want to reevaluate the storage there. Is my suggestion.
Okay, that's a very recurring thing.
Yeah. One more question, and then we'll go on to talk about code generation. So what's the best way of letting Dapper deal with putting results in nested object when it gets the results?
Oh, it sucks at this. It is not good at this. There is an API where you can basically abuse generics and say, I want, you do a query of foo and bar and foo to say, then that says, I'm going to take, partition this table into a foo and a bar, and then I'm going to have my own function myself that maps them together and returns.
Oh, you can do this?
You can do it, but it doesn't work well. It's not great.
It's okay, but it only works one-to-one. If you have nested objects,
then when you have to do that mapping yourself manually. I thought about this a few times and said, I thought, could we do a much better job on that? And it comes back to what Nick said earlier. Yeah, but at that point we're writing EF. So if you are dealing with structured data, that's when I would start thinking, well, use a tool that's designed for that. And I'm not afraid to say, I'm not at all bothered by saying, Dapper doesn't solve every problem. It isn't intended to. Yeah. It's intended for some very, very high usage relatively simple scenarios, but it's the kind of the whether it's 80-20 or 90-10. A lot of your queries are simple enough. They don't need that complexity. So
Absolutely.
I don't want to solve that problem when you guys have already done a good job at it.
Someone phrased this really well for me the other day, and they said, why would I be bad at that when I could be good at this? In terms of scoping your project.
It's a philosophy. It's also a philosophy thing about picking the one thing you want to do and do it really, really well, and not like resist the temptation to like spread out and do a feature creep and do other things.
And the other thing is, I mean, just in terms of resources, I mean, the EF has a team of people and
only
testers,
five engineers. But still, it is a team. I agree.
Dapper has 0 dedicated resource. It has me and Nick when we can find like an evening, or if something comes up that's actually genuinely related to our business interests. Something, we need a new feature for work. Great, no problem. We'll carve out whatever time we need and get that in. But the rest of the time, this comes out of our family time, basically. So we're never ever going to be able to compete with you on features.
How many meaningful community contributions do you guys get, like in general, for Dapper?
Some. It's not 0. It's
Dapper's been idle lately because what the low-hanging fruit is gone. People want to change certain things about Dapper right now, in terms of like more than one voice, right? How enums are handled for type mapping, quoting in Postgres, crowd favorite, and then some of the column names, this kind of thing. So we have a plan to make all of that configurable. All of those changes are breaking. That's the thing. The only thing that's left in the entire PRQ is breaking change. If it's a doc change or something, immediately merge. The breaking stuff needs a coordinated major release, which if we go iDapper and this is a major, we're going to break you. 3.0 is going to, and it'll be strongly named. We'll combine, there's Dapper strong name and Dapper because we were young and naive and there was no guidance, right? No one would pull the trigger on saying you should strong name your libs. I think James Newton King went in and he's like, I'll do it. And he finally published the doc and like settled it, and it's been great. So we did it with Stack Exchange Redis when we did a major version, and we'll do that with Dapper V3 as well.
Will you drop .NET Framework?
In
3.
Yeah, probably, because we're going 3. So 3 has 2 major components. One is changing how we do like iDapper configuration. So like the table mappings, the 2 things that are big for contrib are when you generate the SQL, that overlaps into how do you deserialize the SQL. This column equals this property. So getting that mapping, make it configurable, and where you say, okay, here's the configuration. By default, load from attributes. But also you could just codify whatever you wanted to. And when we generate, or when we currently IL, to do that deserialization, we're based on your properties and mappings, right? When we go to find the members and those kind of things. That's one attribute. Make it configurable, make it do that, make the strong naming. And the other is the AOT stuff and how do those interrelate. That's the 2 big 3.0 questions. Both those take a significant chunk of time, which is... Of course. 2020 was kind of a low motivation period for us. I don't know if anybody else.
For who was it a high motivation period?
Yeah, like what sadistic? Yeah.
Nobody. I mean, I don't think anybody, gets out of bed and says, "Oh, well, we're just going to drop .NET Framework because we just don't care." The point about supporting .NET Framework is, can you do so and still move the product forward in the way you want? Do you end up doing that and then diverging the product so much that the way it works on .NET Framework is not the way it works on .NET or .NET Core?
There's a second bit as well. It's, do I have confidence in it? Have we tested it?
Yeah, all the time that you put in to do all that and test all that and maintain all that. And, at some point you have to say, well, there's .NET Framework stuff. Like Dapper, the current version of Dapper will still work with .NET Framework pretty much forever, right? I mean, so go use that, but do we then keep moving the other thing on .NET Framework when everything else is moving much faster in the core world? So I know it annoys people. It annoys people, and if you have to work on, I mean, Diego Vega, who used to be our PM, is working on a project with Microsoft, and they're still using .NET Framework, and he's frustrated by it, and so he can't use any of this new stuff, and that's sometimes a business reality. But we also have to be able to move things forward. Otherwise, we're just going to stagnate and not get anywhere. So
what's the cost, right? Like if I can build it for, my main concern is to build it for current frameworks. Like I said, you're not saying I can't use Dapper, you're saying I can't use the latest and greatest.
Exactly.
Well, if that's what you cared about, then you wouldn't be on .NET full framework at this point. Like that's a double-sided argument.
But surprisingly, you do have those people who want to stay back on .NET framework and have the latest and greatest various things. That's the thing.
It's tricky because especially with more and more things moving to async, there are some howlers of bugs in .NET framework async things. Is it Semaphore Slim? I think it's got a really nasty one.
That would hurt.
There are. Every bit of software has bugs in it, and the whole thing is in .NET Framework we've found them as we've been doing more and more of these recent things, and they've been fixed. And it's called .NET Core or .NET 5 or .NET 6. That's what the fix is called.
Yes.
So
and also, from an internal perspective, .NET Framework is pretty stable. Like if you want to rely on something that isn't going to change very much, .NET Framework is that thing, right? I mean, it will change for security stuff. So, we'll break people using binary serializer. No, sorry, binary formatter, but because we have to for security. But other than that, we try not to make lots of changes to it, because when you make changes, you basically, however good you are, you're going to lose some of that stability and some of that, okay, we regressed this or we broke that. And so it's kind of like two different buckets. Like you can't really have both very stable and just works like it always has done, and evolve it fast and, make it much faster and have all this new stuff as we go forward. So it's kind of, you really have to choose which bucket you want to be in there.
Yeah. It's a lot of groups. I'd say a lot of devs, being fair to them on full framework, they don't have a choice. They're in the environment. If they would go .NET Core, they could. I think most devs probably are in that bucket, right?
Yes.
But from a company standpoint, if you're not willing to upgrade to .NET because it's, we want full stability, we don't want to break things, then why are you going to the newest brand spanking version of a lib from some random person on GitHub? From my point of view,
because it fixes some bug, and you want that bug fixed, right? I mean, that's what usually happens.
And eventually, if we shut down full framework support and say, okay, this is the max version, and we're no longer going to upgrade that compatibility, then it gives you more ammo to say our org needs to upgrade. I mean, we're upgraded. So Stack Overflow's moved to .NET Core on most things. Not everything's moved yet. Things that just are not as high a priority. They are not moved. But we're forcing that issue with some of the things internally, because having that baggage, effectively it becomes heavier baggage. You too have to support it in build tooling or libraries or whatever internally, right? You want to be over that for like 5,000 reasons now. So
so I just put this up there because I was surprised to see this. Somebody trying to use Dapper inside the hosted CLR in SQL Server.
I am not even going to try and debug that. You're on your own.
Is that still a thing?
Good luck with that.
You can't riff it inside.
I think it's strongly discouraged.
That's a really
by
challenging
now,
thing.
right?
So Matt, good luck with that. Get in touch with us if you manage to make it work. It'll be interesting to see, but that's hard.
That shouldn't work. You're not allowed to admit there. There was a really fun bug there in .NET Core 3.1, I think. There was a bug that it was checking that if you were using system.drawing that you shouldn't be able to do it.
Yes.
And then it loaded in SQL Server. Yeah, so system drawing you're not supposed to use, and then they refed the type to check that you're not using the type inside of SQL Server, which couldn't load the type, and then everything broke because the check to make sure you're not using it was using it.
Ironic.
Yes,
that was my favorite. That was great.
So let's talk about code generation, Refemit. So just kind of a little bit of background. So a lot of time, if you're doing these ORE things, either Dapper or EF, then the way historically you make these things fast is you don't just basically write code that reads the metadata and then it says, oh, if it looks like this, then go do that. If it looks like that, then put that field there. Instead, what you meta generate code, which can either be, Refemit IL directly, or what we do in EF Core is we write delegates. We write expression trees and then compile those into delegates. EF6 and not EF6 actually, because I removed it all, but the original versions of EF did do ref emit, but then we moved over to just doing compiled delegates. So Marc, do you see ref emit still giving you major advantage, or is that just something historically that you haven't changed over to?
Pretty much the latter. And there are, so in fact, can I share on this?
Yeah.
Work? Yeah. So if I do, hang on, let me. Right, do I have to do a whole screen? Do I? 1 second. Oh no, Chrome tab. Yeah, so I've got a blog post on this. So there are a number of, and I'll get this in the show notes afterwards, but there are a number of problems kind of with ref emit, and I kind of discuss them all in here. And the first one is it's really, really hard.
Yes.
So you said you've moved to expression trees, and I totally get that. There are some horrible ways to shoot yourself in the foot with IL. Sometimes it'll tell you that you've got an invalid program exception. Sometimes it won't. Sometimes you'll get a call from Microsoft 3 months down the line telling you you've used the wrong opcode and it's taken down some.
Happened once.
It happened.
Nice.
Yeah. So it's really hard, and it limits the people who can kind of maintain that code, which is a problem. And the other
Marc,
thing is,
could you zoom just a little bit for people to see?
Sure.
Sorry to interrupt.
Awesome. Mostly, I'm not going to go and show. It's a long blog post, but I'll get it in the show notes. But it's kind of talking about through it. But one of the other problems, big problems with ref emit is with the increase of async await code. Now, when you write, just add the async modifier in C# and do a couple of awaits, it looks like you're not doing a lot, but it's behind the scenes, the compiler does so much for you that it's just incredible. And if you were trying to do that kind of thing in ref emit, you just give up. That's not going to happen.
And it's not only that it does a lot of very hard stuff that's hard to understand and very hard to get right if you don't understand exactly why it's doing what it's doing.
Yes. So it's really, really complex stuff. So you can kind of get around that by kind of having an async core that calls, as Arthur said, you've got some compiled delegates, but then you kind of mix and matching worlds, and it works kind of ish, not good. And then you get into the whole other problem that Nick was saying a minute ago. You can't always use ref emit in some platforms. You've got AOT, where the whole ref emit APIs are just blocked from you. So there's this whole bunch of scenarios where ref emit just kind of falls down. So what I've been looking at recently is kind of a reimagining of Dapper. And let me just. Do I need to click share again? Oh, actually, no. I'll just
change the URL.
Change the URL.
It's a web browser. You can change Patreon if you want to.
I can do that.
For anyone curious, AOT means ahead of time compilation. And where if you're an iPhone app and you're reviewed by the App Store, they really don't like it when you compile random code after the fact when it's running on the device. So they don't allow that. That's the kind. Although people running an app connecting to a remote SQL server directly, I also have questions about. But
true. But SQLite, you do have SQLite as an option.
Yeah, that's true.
It's actually true though. It's not just ref emit on, for example, iOS that you can't do. Also, if you try and do what EF Core does, where it compiles delegates, it looks like it works,
but it doesn't runtime reflection. Yeah,
it doesn't. It actually runs an interpreter, so it basically interprets the code. So when you're trying to write fast code, the reason you've written the delegate and compiled it is to make it fast, and then it interprets it. That kind of defeats the purpose of it. So that's why some of this AOT stuff is really interesting for things going forward. So back to Marc.
Yeah, so basically, there's a whole load of things that we currently do in Dapper where, the first time we see a particular strategy, we'll generate a whole ton of code and we'll cache it, and we'll try and, when we see, then we've got to try and match that cache and kind of reuse things. But that doesn't always work. So Dapper AOT, and this, we may or may not put this into, it's undecided. As I say, we've got very limited time, but it's basically a kind of a reimagining of Dapper. So if I just go into kind of a couple of examples, the idea is that rather than having your code kind of do lots and lots of things, deep connection dot query of this, instead we could just do things like write a method. So here, say I want to have a method.
Can you zoom again, please? Sorry.
No problem. Say I just want to have a method that executes the query, select star from customers or region equals region, and takes in a SQL connection. Then I could just I can just said everything I've said there. I can actually just say as a partial method in C#. And what we can do is have new Roslyn generators come in and do all the hard work for us. So if I go back a layer and look at this is code that the tool then looked at our code and spat out all this stuff to go with it. So you can see in here, this is all the goodness that Dapper currently does behind the scenes. This is how hard it is to get get ADO.NET right for a very, very simple operation. You've got so many things that people don't know to do. But the idea is that if we generate all that code in a generator, then it happens when you press build in Visual Studio. Nothing at all happens at runtime. Everything's generated way up in advance, and we have to do a little bit of clever code in a few places. But I think I figured out how to make it all work. It just needs some time to kind of polish it and kind of finish it all off. But that's kind of the crux of the Dapper AOT is to kind of just get away from the scenario of having to do ref emit at all by moving that code into a code generator, and that then is just regular simple C# that's emitting strings in, I think it's a string builder or something that's a wrapper of a string builder, so just to handle indentation, and that means that pretty much anybody can go in and suggest improvements to that code easily, and B, this is literally outputs from the unit test. So the unit test thing has just a wildcard pattern that only takes the inputs and then overwrites the outputs. So if I go and change my generator and run the tests, then the outputs will change in GitHub form automatically. So I can see exactly what's going on. And so, and if somebody proposes a change, I can see what impact that had. So I can have a lot more confidence then that I'm not doing something terrible in the code generation step, which is one of the most complicated parts of.
I saw in your post on this that it's even less it's not necessarily supposed to improve actual runtime performance so much as simply simplify the code in a dramatic way so that you can start doing new stuff and improving it in a way that's very difficult right now.
The ref emit is kind of it's so complicated and it's so many moving parts to keep in your head, and no matter how well you comment it, is trying to keep the stack right now is this and this and this and this.
It's like coding in assembly in a way.
Yeah, it really is. It makes it very, very hard to change to make any kind of feature changes. So whereas with this, it's kind of a blank slate. It's all very, very maintainable. So it's something I would like to explore more. What I need is time.
Time. Yeah. So. It looks very exciting. Even in terms of generating code, even when you do the EF core approach of creating a big expression tree and compiling it, even then, I think we have an item on the backlog to do better at this. But it's very easy to accidentally generate code that isn't very performant or does silly things. For example, it's very easy to forget to store the result of some expression in a variable and instead just evaluate that multiple times. And if you would just saw the code in front of you, you'd be like,
exactly,
that's dumb. But when you're, it's all building this up dynamically and you can't really see what it outputs, that's really easy to do those kinds of
code generation is hard.
It is, yes.
But the other thing about this is it means that consumers can then step through debug it and they can see what it generated. So they know that no magic is going on at runtime that's going to do something wildly different to what they expect. They can say, oh, it did something weird on this line. I can see it. I hit the breakpoint. You know. So that's all great.
So is Dapper 3 going to be this, or is it going to be this plus also the Dapper as we know it today, that composite runtime? Do you already know these? Do you know where you want to go with this?
Don't know.
Shay wants you to commit right now.
Just asking. I'm just curious.
Dapper 3 should support the current API service area like it looks, right? Like commands and attributes and all. We got to figure out, is that an addition? Is that a replacement? That'd be a hard sell for you, because making a dynamic query like that just doesn't work, right? So we need to support most of the current use cases. Hopefully we can do both dynamic code generation or like runtime generation. Someone's asking in chat right now, should Roslyn make this easier? It does. It's what we generate code with.
Yes.
That's the thing here. And while it's not easy to understand the Roslyn code generator, there's some onboarding to do that. It is approachable if you want to spend the time. But more importantly, you can evaluate the results. You're in memory, you're doing it, evaluating it. Your audience of people who can contribute in any meaningful way gets humongously bigger by doing it this way. Anything you simplify, I'm a huge advocate of simplifying anything you can. That's the whole ethos of everything we've designed at Stack, right? It's easier to build, it's easier to design, it's easier to debug, it's easier to maintain, all of these things. So in primarily, this is a simplification above all else, in my view. But that's the big win.
It's worth pointing out, this is dependent on some very, very new features. This isn't stuff where we couldn't be bothered to do it the proper way before or anything like that. Yeah. This is, I think, the partial methods. Is that C#10, where you can have return values from partials? Yes. Yeah. We need that. And the generator support itself is, that's in the build, very recent versions of the build SDK. These are fairly cutting edge tools.
Yep. It's .NET 5 and above only for that.
Yes, the build
section.
Yes.
The build SDK.
The C# version is limited.
Yeah, but you can still use you can hack it. You can
hack it.
You can still use C#10 on .NET.
I have opinions.
4.5, but it's not supported, I don't think.
If it's not supported, I'd say for the wide audience, it doesn't exist. Is the way I've tend to view it. Yeah, you can't. There's a lot of things in C# that actually work in other places. There might be remove my MVP word for
I mean, I'm speaking slightly outside my scope here, so I don't take what I'm saying for gospel or anything, but I think what we're hoping is that people will be able to move forward with their .NET framework, their SDK, and their compiler much more rapidly in this kind of new world that we're in compared to the way things were on .NET framework, where people using .NET framework 3.5 SP1 apps still. I mean, so
still queries about it.
Exactly, and so. There's pros and cons of that approach. Obviously, it's not easy to keep up, but then again, it allows us to get the big perf improvements and things like that people really want by moving forward more rapidly and evolving things, and all the great new C# features that have been coming out in the last few years. Also we can do that stuff because we're not saying everything has to work on every down level version of everything else kind of thing. So
actually, it's worth mentioning another thing that I was thinking of when I started on the Dapper AOT stuff is there's I'm not going to have the URL on me, but Shay and a few others have been looking at a potential reimagining of the SQL Server API. And it would be virtually impossible to make Dapper work as it stands on that. But with something like the code generation approach, it would actually be presumably fairly minimal changes to from the consumer perspective. Instead of taking a DB connection or an SQL connection, it would take whatever this other abstraction is, and then because the build tool just has to recognize the pattern. And it could then generate code suitable for this other data access API, and that's the other thing I had in my mind when I was doing this. And there is no way on this earth that I am going to be able to get Dapper version working on.
Well, one of the big questions in that project is whether that new experimental new SQL client thing would be an ADO.NET provider or not. That's like, I'm actually a big supporter of keeping it ADO.NET. You might not like that specific thing, but that's my idea in any case, among other things, so that Dapper and EF Core and any other .NET data access can still be used with it. But that's a question for another time.
Yeah, we're not going to answer that now. But I'm glad you brought that up because we're over time already. But I wanted to touch on I think we're calling it SQL Server.core. This was
SQL Client.core.
No, it's not SQL Client.core because remember we're not allowed to call it SQL Client.
Oh, okay, sorry.
But Hunter approved SQL Server.core. So
there is a SQL Server.core. There is a SQL Server.core. It doesn't have a hit.
Anyway, whatever. Codename Woodstar is what we kind of call it internally. Woodstar is a little super fast flying bird thing. So yeah, Woodstar.
Light and fast.
Yeah, so for people who don't know, we'll put the link in the show notes to this repo as well. So this is something that we talked about probably about a year ago now, where SQL Client, which is the name for the ADO.NET provider for SQL Server, is a very old beast, and it's got a lot of legacy code, legacy behaviors. It's pretty complicated code base. It's quite hard to move forward. At the same time, it supports all of those features in SQL Server. There's a lot of things. We talked about the running the CLR inside SQL Server and using custom types that serialize across and all that kind of stuff. And there's loads of things in there, but if we want to do something in the kind of .NET Core vein where this is fast and kind of breaks a little bit with historical, whether it's not an ADO.NET provider at all, as we talked about, or something different, but even if it is, that it doesn't necessarily support all those things, it doesn't necessarily behave exactly the same, and yet it's fast. Basically, that's the idea, to make this thing fast, the fastest way we can access SQL Server as possible, so that hopefully then we can kind of compete with Postgres in terms of its provider, which is currently, the fastest we have on .NET for accessing a database, relational database. Now, Smit on our team, Smit's the guy who basically wrote most of the query pipeline from, other people, Marisi and Shay and everybody has contributed too, but he's kind of the architect of the query pipeline that we rewrote in 3.1. He basically rewrote it in 3.1 and has moved it forward. And, in terms of him looking for kind of new challenges and opportunities, as we move forward, he's going to spend more and more time working on this. But we also really want to get people from the community to come in and give us their ideas. I think we've had Tim Seward on there already, Wraith too, who's just commented there, is interested. And Nick and Marc have also expressed interest in making sure this thing works well. So that's kind of a thing for the future that hopefully will end up being an exciting, fast way to access SQL Server with EF Core support, possibly Dapper support, maybe Dapper AOT only, depending on how these things go. But anyway, it's very open-ended at the moment, so yeah, it's exciting. So. I think we had one of the goals that it could do everything that Stack Overflow needed to do in it. So that's kind of like the feature boundary, which you think isn't as much as you think, right, Nick? It's like you don't use a whole lot of the esoteric features of SQL Server. So
don't do things. That's how you go fast. Just don't do a lot of things. Yeah, people were like, how do you build fast applications? Like, do you need to be doing these 9 things? They're like, well, yeah, you needed 6 of those, right? Well, then don't do the other 4.
Yeah,
that's it. Like, and I promise you, if you're like, we're on hardware, so we like, perf and that kind of thing. But if you're on a cloud provider that has a billing department, they're probably going to like that too. So like, performance is a feature. This was something near and dear to like everybody that's been at Stack for a while. So yeah, don't do at any level. Don't do crap you don't need to do. Think about a way to simplify it. Because if you think, oh, I'm clever, I can do this in a 5 times more complicated way, I'm like, okay, did you ever get the time back you spent complicating that and maintaining it and everything else from the perf you got out of it? Like, it better be good. Start with simple.
The 3 days you spent debugging it when something nuanced happened.
It was a capital A. Yeah.
You may think it. I mean, I totally agree with keeping it simple. Which, given that I work on EF Core, you might think is a little ironic since it's not all that simple. But in a sense, if you're writing something that is inherently complicated, which an ORM is, I think anybody who's tried to, there's people who will say, "Oh, I can do an ORM in one day." No, you can't. Not a good one, anyway. It is a complicated thing, but it's more important to try and keep things simple when they have a tendency to go complicated even. It's like any way you can keep it simpler in EF, then do so. That being said, sometimes, Shay puts in complexity for perf, and we say that's okay.
Yeah, and Dapper's not simple underneath the covers, right? It does what it needs to do. And in that case, your justification should be there. Dapper's, in EF Core, you're talking about tens or hundreds of millions of downloads across those kind of projects, right? Sure, in that case, the surface should remain as simple as possible. And then beneath, you do what you need to do to serve that many use cases. And in that case, you're like, okay, by making this twice as fast, I could save millions of dollars in electricity.
Right.
From the people running it.
That's the thing. You're at the bottom of the stack of so many applications around the world. Your impact and little things that you do impact so much around the world. That's something I constantly keep in mind. It's very important.
Yeah. Now I'm thinking of that XKCD thing with there's this all modern technology, and then there's like this one little thing, one guy in Nebraska or something.
VGA
holding it all up. We
were talking to someone on the .NET team about this, and they were talking about a string concatenation, which is on the order of nanoseconds of a change they were looking at for .NET 6. Is this worth it? And there's does this matter to anyone's application? And the answer is no. Like, it's just not enough measurable perf to do it. But when you multiply it by the world impact of the ecosystem of things running .NET, and this would save so much electricity or carbon per month, and it's like that's just weird to think about that level of scale from a nanosecond level change. Very cool.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we're quite a bit over time, but it's been a really interesting discussion. I don't know, Jeremy, was there any last question or anything, or should we just wrap it up here? It looks like Jeremy might have frozen. So I guess we'll just. Sorry, go ahead, Jeremy.
I'm just time delayed. I'm gonna just
fourth
close
dimension's
out
tricky.
The Nick and Marc, and then I'm gonna be quiet.
Jeremy's joining us from the beyond.
Jeremy has internet lag from the 1990s, where everything would stop for a few minutes and then you just carry on. So
that's why async APIs are important.
Exactly.
Exactly.
This is
Okay. This is a good one to end with. Best of luck where you're going next, Nick. Not publicly announced, but we're looking forward to hearing that. So good luck with that. And thank you to both of you guys. It's been really interesting, a lot of fun talking to you. And
pleasure.
We'll see you everybody else next time. I don't know what's next, but I'm sure it'll be something good. Bye.